I am Rhonda, 35 years old, and what happened at my father George's retirement party still makes my heart race when I think about it. For years, I had supported my family financially, despite my stepmother Diane treating me like an outsider. That elegant restaurant became the backdrop for a confrontation 25 years in the making. When Diane laughed and said those words to me, something finally broke. I had no idea my response would change everything forever. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and stick around to see how I finally stood up for myself after decades of silence. My childhood started out pretty normal. I lived with both my biological parents in a small suburban home in Minnesota. We were never wealthy, but I remember feeling secure and loved. My mom Amanda worked as a nurse at the local hospital, and my dad George was employed at a manufacturing company. They seemed happy together from what my 8-year-old self could tell, though looking back, I realized there were signs of trouble I was too young to recognize. Their arguments grew more frequent as I entered second grade. They tried to hide it from me, but our house was small and the walls were thin. I would lie awake at night, clutching my stuffed bear as their heated words traveled up the stairs. Then, one day Mom sat me down and explained they were getting divorced. Dad moved out the following weekend. The custody arrangement gave my father visitation every other weekend. Those weekends became precious to me. Dad would pick me up in his old blue sedan and we would get ice cream before heading to the small apartment he had rented. He always made those weekends special, despite having limited funds. We would build pillow forts, watch cartoons, and sometimes go to the park when weather permitted. Just before my 10th birthday, Dad introduced me to Diane. She smiled a lot that first meeting, but even as a child, I sensed something hollow behind her expressions. She had 2 children from a previous marriage, Jessica, who was 11, and Troy, who was 7. Dad seemed smitten with her, his eyes following her around the room like she was the answer to every question he had ever asked. They married 3 months later in a small ceremony. I was a flower girl walking down the aisle in a dress that itched around the collar. The photographer arranged us for family photos, and that was the first time I noticed how Diane subtly positioned her children front and center while I was placed slightly apart. Living with them part-time was an exercise in feeling invisible. Diane transformed the spare room into my bedroom, but it always felt temporary, like a guest room I was borrowing. Jessica and Troy had rooms decorated to their preferences with new furniture, while mine contained mismatched pieces no one else wanted. The family vacations revealed the pattern most clearly. When I was 12, we took a trip to Florida. Diane had meticulously planned activities that Jessica and Troy would enjoy. When I expressed interest in visiting a marine sanctuary, Diane sighed and said, "That would take time away from what the family wants to do." Dad looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Birthday celebrations marked another stark difference. Jessica and Troy enjoyed elaborate parties with themes and numerous presents. My birthdays were acknowledged with a store-bought cake and usually a single gift. Once when I was 14, I overheard Diane telling my father, "I just do not feel right spending as much on someone who is not really my child." Holiday gatherings at extended family homes were perhaps the most painful. Diane would introduce Jessica and Troy to distant relatives with, "These are my children," while I stood awkwardly until my father would add, "And this is my daughter Rhonda." Diane would often make comments about blood family when discussing holiday traditions or family resemblances, effectively drawing a circle that excluded me. Throughout all of this, my father George remained frustratingly passive. He was a man who avoided conflict at all costs, having grown up in a household where arguments escalated quickly. I could see his discomfort when Diane would make these distinctions, but he rarely spoke up. His method of compensating was to try to create special moments with just the 2 of us, like our traditional Saturday morning breakfasts at the local diner or fishing trips twice a year. These moments sustained me. I cherished the memory of Dad teaching me to cast a fishing line at the lake when I was 13. He was so patient, showing me again and again until I got it right. When I finally made a good cast, his proud smile made me feel like the most important person in his world. Or the time when I was 16 and having trouble with geometry, he stayed up until midnight helping me prepare for a test, even though he had to be at work at 6 the next morning. Despite Diane's efforts to marginalize me, I was determined to maintain my relationship with my father. I would call him at work sometimes, knowing Diane would not be there to monitor our conversation. We developed a silent understanding about the situation at home, though we never directly addressed it. Looking back, I wish we had. There were cousins on my father's side who noticed the disparity in treatment. My cousin Laura once confronted my father about it at a family barbecue when I was 17. I overheard her saying, "George, do you not see what is happening with Rhonda?" He brushed it off with vague reassurances. But the seed of acknowledgement had been planted. By the time I finished high school, I had learned to protect myself emotionally by lowering my expectations. I stopped hoping for Diane's approval or inclusion. Instead, I focused on my father and the genuine bond we shared, complicated as it was by his unwillingness to stand up to his wife. It was an imperfect solution to a painful situation, but it allowed me to preserve the most important relationship in my young life. High school was challenging in ways beyond typical teenage angst. While my friends complained about curfews and chores, I was navigating a home life where I felt like an unwelcome guest half the time. Diane never explicitly said I was unwanted, but her constant subtle exclusions spoke volumes. My father, forever the peacekeeper, remained blind to how these dynamics affected me. Despite the emotional turbulence at home, I maintained excellent grades. School became my sanctuary, a place where I could excel on my own merits without the shadow of family politics. I joined the debate team and discovered I had a talent for persuasive communication. My English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, became an important mentor, encouraging me to channel my complicated emotions into writing and public speaking. To gain some financial independence, I started working at a local coffee shop when I turned 16. The job was exhausting, especially while maintaining my academic standing, but it taught me valuable lessons about responsibility and self-reliance. More importantly, it gave me spending money that was mine alone, reducing my need to ask Diane or my father for anything. As college application season approached, I realized I had another hurdle to overcome. During a rare private conversation with my father, I brought up college funding. His face fell as he explained that they had been saving for college, but primarily for Jessica and Troy. "We figured you could get scholarships with your grades," he said, unable to meet my eyes. The unspoken reality was clear. Diane had prioritized her biological children's futures over mine. That night, I cried into my pillow, then dried my tears and made a plan. I applied for every scholarship I could find, wrote countless essays, and eventually secured enough financial aid to cover about 60% of my tuition at a state university. For the remainder, I took out substantial student loans, a burden my step-siblings would never have to bear. College life brought new freedoms, but also new financial pressures. I worked 20 hours a week at the campus bookstore while carrying a full course load. During summers and breaks, I picked up additional jobs, sometimes working 50 or 60 hours weekly between two positions. There were nights I fell asleep over my textbooks, exhausted but determined. End of 2. My chosen major was business administration with a concentration in marketing. I discovered I had a knack for understanding consumer psychology and developing effective campaigns. My professors noticed my work ethic and creativity, often using my projects as examples for other students. The grueling schedule paid off when I graduated with honors. Standing on that stage in my cap and gown, scanning the audience, I spotted my father beaming proudly. Diane sat beside him, clapping politely but without enthusiasm. Jessica and Troy had not bothered to attend. That moment crystallized something for me. I had done this largely on my own, and there was both pain and power in that realization. My first job after college was as a marketing assistant at a small firm in Minneapolis. The starting salary was modest, but it offered valuable experience and, importantly, health insurance. I shared a cramped apartment with 2 roommates to keep expenses low, while I focused on paying down my student loans. Those early professional years taught me to be strategic and resilient. I volunteered for challenging projects, worked longer hours than required, and continuously expanded my skill set through online courses and workshops. My boss, Linda, recognized my potential and became another important mentor, showing me how to navigate office politics and advocate for myself professionally. Within 3 years, I had earned 2 promotions and significantly increased my salary. When a position opened at a larger marketing agency in Chicago, Linda reluctantly wrote me a glowing recommendation. "They would be lucky to have you," she said during our goodbye lunch. "Just do not forget who gave you your start." I promised I would not. The move to Chicago marked a turning point. The new position as a marketing manager came with substantially higher pay and more responsibility. The learning curve was steep, but I thrived on the challenge. My campaign for a regional restaurant chain caught the attention of industry publications, earning both the agency and me some valuable recognition. By my early 30s, I had climbed to the position of marketing director at one of the most prestigious firms in the Midwest. My salary had reached 6 figures, a milestone that seemed impossible during those grueling college years. I had paid off my student loans and begun building a solid investment portfolio based on advice from financial advisors. With my financial situation stable, I achieved a dream that had seemed unattainable years earlier, buying my own home. It was a modest 2-bedroom condo in a pleasant neighborhood, but it was mine. The day I got the keys, I stood alone in the empty living room, tears streaming down my face. This space was truly mine, a place where I would never feel like an unwelcome guest. As my career flourished, an unexpected pattern began to emerge in my family relationships. Despite years of emotional distance, I found myself in a position to help financially when needs arose. The first instance came when Troy, now in his 20s, needed a reliable car to commute to his new job. Diane called my father, who then reluctantly called me to see if I might loan Troy some money. Against my better judgment, I agreed, sending $5,000 with the understanding it would be repaid gradually. Several months later, Jessica needed help with college application fees for graduate school. Again, the request came through my father, never directly from Diane or Jessica. I sent the money without hesitation, though I noted the irony of helping fund Jessica's education when no one had helped with mine. These initial requests opened a floodgate I had not anticipated. What began as occasional loans that were never repaid evolved into an expectation that I would serve as the family's financial safety net. Despite the history of exclusion and emotional neglect, I found myself repeatedly opening my wallet when asked. Perhaps I was still seeking approval in some way, or maybe I simply wanted to be the bigger person. Whatever the psychology behind it, I became the go-to person whenever money was needed, even as I remained an outsider in all other respects. 3 years ago, my half-brother Troy was involved in a serious car accident. He was hospitalized for 2 weeks with multiple injuries, including a broken leg and internal bruising. While he had basic health insurance through his employer, it did not cover all the expenses. The gaps in coverage were substantial, leaving the family with medical bills exceeding $30,000. I learned about the accident through my father, not Diane or Jessica. Dad called me late one evening, his voice strained as he explained the situation. "Troy is going to be okay," he assured me, "but the bills are overwhelming." Diane is beside herself with worry. He did not directly ask for money, but the implication hung heavy in his words. Without hesitation, I offered to help. "Send me the bills that insurance would not cover," I told him. Within days, I had transferred $25,000 to cover the majority of Troy's outstanding medical expenses. I received a brief text message from Troy, saying, "Thanks, sis," and nothing from Diane, though my father expressed his gratitude repeatedly. Not long after Troy's recovery, Jessica faced a crisis of her own. She had been awarded a partial scholarship for her master's program in education, but the funding unexpectedly fell through midway through her first semester. She stood to lose her place in the program unless she could pay the remaining tuition balance of $18,000. This time, the call came from Jessica herself, the first time she had reached out to me directly in years. Her voice was thick with tears as she explained her predicament. Despite our distant relationship, I could hear the genuine distress in her voice. "I do not know who else to ask," she admitted. "Mom and Dad do not have this kind of money." I transferred the funds the next day. Jessica sent a bouquet of flowers with a card expressing her appreciation. Later, I discovered through my father that Diane had told extended family members that we pulled together as a family to keep Jessica in school, with no mention of where the majority of the money had actually come from. The most significant financial support came when my father and Diane's home suffered extensive damage during a severe storm. A large tree had fallen onto the roof, causing structural damage and subsequent water damage from the heavy rainfall. Their homeowner's insurance covered only a portion of the necessary repairs, leaving them approximately $30,000 short of what was needed to make the home habitable again. My father called me clearly uncomfortable with having to ask for help yet again. "Rhonda, I would not ask if there was any other way," he began. "The insurance is not enough, and the contractors cannot start work until we have the full amount." I arranged for a wire transfer of $30,000 the following day. My father was overwhelmed with gratitude, repeatedly telling me he would find a way to pay me back eventually, though we both knew that was unlikely given his fixed retirement income. Diane sent a brief thank you note that felt perfunctory rather than genuinely appreciative. What I did not discover until months later was that while some of the money went toward necessary repairs, a significant portion funded a kitchen renovation that had nothing to do with the storm damage. Diane had apparently convinced my father that since they were doing construction anyway, it made sense to upgrade the kitchen she had been complaining about for years. This pattern continued with increasing frequency. What began as assistance during genuine emergencies evolved into requests for money to cover everything from car repairs to property taxes to Troy's wedding expenses. Each time the request would come through my father rather than directly from Diane, Jessica, or Troy. Diane's sense of entitlement grew alongside the frequency of these requests. She began to speak of my financial assistance as though it were an obligation rather than a generosity. "Rhonda can cover it," she would tell my father, according to him. "She has more than enough money." More troubling was how Diane would take credit for things I had funded. When relatives complimented the new deck on their house, Diane would simply say, "Yes, we decided it was time for an upgrade," never mentioning that I had provided the $8,000 that made it possible. She showed off Jessica's graduate degree at family gatherings as though she had been the one to rescue her daughter's education. Throughout all of this, my father remained a passive enabler. He was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to confront Diane about her behavior. When I occasionally expressed frustration to him in private, he would say things like, "You know how Diane is," or "She just has a different way of showing appreciation." His conflict avoidance had become so ingrained that he seemed incapable of addressing the inequity. My resentment grew steadily, though I kept it largely to myself. I loved my father deeply and wanted to support him, but I was increasingly aware that I was being used by Diane with his tacit permission. The emotional toll became harder to ignore with each passing month. The situation reached a new level of absurdity when Diane and my father purchased a vacation cabin by a lake 3 hours from their home. My father mentioned it casually during one of our phone calls, saying they had found a great deal on a fixer-upper. When I expressed interest in seeing it, there was an awkward pause before he said, "Well, Diane is still getting it set up how she wants it. Maybe later in the summer." Summer came and went without an invitation. Through social media posts by Jessica, I learned that the entire family, including extended relatives from Diane's side, had enjoyed several weekends at the cabin. I had not been invited once. The final straw came when I discovered that $10,000 I had provided for what my father described as urgent roof repairs had actually funded a luxury cruise for Diane, my father, Jessica, and Troy. I learned about this not from any of them, but from a mutual friend who had seen Diane's social media posts about their dream family vacation. That discovery forced me to confront the reality of my position in the family. I was valued for my financial contributions, but not considered worthy of inclusion in the benefits those contributions made possible. I was the family bank, not a family member, a distinction Diane had been making since I was 10 years old. After 35 years with the same manufacturing company, my father announced his retirement. He had worked his way up from the factory floor to operations manager, a career trajectory he was rightfully proud of. When he called to share the news, I could hear the mixture of relief and apprehension in his voice. "It is going to be strange not going to the same place every morning," he admitted. Diane was in the background of the call, and I heard her say, "We will just have a small family dinner to celebrate. Nothing fancy needed." The dismissive tone in her voice bothered me. My father deserved more recognition for his decades of dedicated service. "Dad, you should have a proper retirement party," I interjected. "All those years of hard work should be celebrated with colleagues and friends too, not just a quiet dinner." There was a pause before my father responded. That would be nice, but we do not need to go to any trouble. Let me plan something, I offered. I want to do this for you. You deserve a real celebration. Despite some hesitation, he agreed, and I immediately began researching venues. I spent evenings after work contacting local restaurants and event spaces, comparing prices and amenities. Eventually, I settled on Riverside Terrace, an elegant restaurant with a private dining room overlooking the city river. The space could comfortably accommodate 50 guests and offered a sophisticated ambiance that seemed fitting for the occasion. Once the venue was secured, I created a comprehensive guest list with my father's help. We included current and former colleagues, friends from his bowling league, extended family members, and neighbors. I designed formal invitations and mailed them 6 weeks before the event. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with nearly everyone accepting. Menu selection was the next task. I arranged a tasting session at the restaurant, inviting my father and Diane to join me. Diane initially declined, saying she was too busy, but eventually agreed when my father insisted. Throughout the tasting, she made minimal contributions to the discussion, but had plenty of criticisms afterward as we walked to our cars. The chicken was too dry, she complained, and I think we should have more appetizer options. When I explained that additional appetizers would increase the per-person cost, she shrugged and said, "Well, you are paying for it, so it should be done right." I bit my tongue and made note of her preferences, later adjusting the menu to accommodate them, despite the additional expense. The final selection included premium appetizers, a choice of 3 entrees, and a custom cake designed to resemble the company logo where my father had spent his career. One of the most meaningful elements I prepared was a photo slideshow documenting my father's life and career. I reached out to his colleagues for photographs from company events over the years and dug through old family albums for personal milestones. The resulting presentation chronicled his journey from young factory worker to respected manager, interspersed with family moments and achievements. As the event drew closer, I noticed Diane increasingly inserting herself into the planning process. She began contacting the venue directly to make changes to arrangements we had already finalized. She switched the seating chart I had carefully created, moving her friends and relatives to the prime tables nearest my father. She even changed the cake design without consulting me, opting for something she preferred aesthetically. Each time I discovered one of these alterations, I would call her to discuss it. "Oh, I thought you would be too busy to handle all these details," she would say dismissively. "I am just trying to help." The fact that I was paying for everything seemed to escape her notice or concern. More frustrating was how Diane began telling extended family members that she was organizing the entire party. My Aunt Clara called me to ask a question about the event and mentioned Diane told me she has been working so hard planning this special celebration for George. When I clarified that I was actually handling the arrangements and covering all expenses, my aunt seemed genuinely surprised. "Oh," she said awkwardly. Diane made it sound like it was all her doing. She was complaining about how stressful it has been to put everything together. This pattern repeated itself with several other relatives and friends. By the time I realized what was happening, Diane had effectively rewritten the narrative about the party planning. In the version she was sharing, she was the devoted wife creating a memorable retirement celebration, while my role was minimized or erased entirely. The day before the party, I visited the restaurant for a final walkthrough. To my surprise, Diane was already there, instructing the staff about last-minute changes to the table settings and room layout. When she saw me, she barely acknowledged my presence before continuing her conversation with the event coordinator. "The centerpieces need to be higher," she was saying, "and we will need an extra table for gifts near the entrance." I stood there watching as she rearranged everything I had carefully planned. The event coordinator looked uncomfortable, glancing between us as if sensing the tension. When Diane finally paused for breath, I calmly explained that we had already finalized all these details during my previous visits. "Well, I am making improvements," Diane said with a dismissive wave. "This is George's big day and everything needs to be perfect." "I agree," I replied, struggling to keep my voice level. "That is why I have been planning this for the past 2 months. Diane gave me a cold smile. "And now I am helping to make sure it is actually done right. George is my husband after all. I know what he would want better than anyone. The implication was clear. Despite my efforts and financial investment, I was an outsider. In Diane's mind, her position as wife trumped my position as daughter, regardless of who was putting in the work or paying the bills. It was a dynamic as old as our relationship, but it stung no less sharply for its familiarity. I swallowed my frustration and focused on the reason for the celebration: my father's retirement. This event was about honoring him, not about my complicated relationship with Diane. I reminded myself of this repeatedly as I drove home that evening, trying to prepare emotionally for the party the following night. I arrived at Riverside Terrace 2 hours early on the day of the party. The restaurant staff was putting final touches on the room, arranging the tables according to the seating chart and setting up the audio-visual equipment for the slideshow. I had brought additional decorations, including framed photographs of my father throughout his career and custom signage, welcoming guests to the celebration. As I was directing the placement of these items, Diane walked in. She was dressed in an expensive-looking new outfit I had never seen before, complete with a designer handbag I recognized from luxury advertisements. Without greeting me, she immediately began speaking to the staff as though she was in charge. "The welcome table should be over there," she instructed, pointing to the opposite side of the room from where I had planned it. "And these photographs need to be rearranged. They do not flow properly." The staff members looked to me for guidance, clearly confused about who was actually in authority. I smiled tightly and said, "Let us stick with the original arrangement, please. We planned it to optimize traffic flow for guests." Diane shot me an irritated look, but said nothing as she moved on to inspect the bar setup. I continued working with the staff, trying to ignore the tension her presence created. My father arrived 30 minutes later, looking distinguished in a new suit. His face lit up when he saw the room, his eyes taking in all the thoughtful details I had arranged. "This is incredible, Rhonda," he said, giving me a warm hug. "You really went above and beyond." Before I could respond, Diane was at his side, her arm linked through his. "Wait until you see the slideshow I put together," she said. "Everyone is going to love it." I felt my jaw tighten at her casual appropriation of my work, but I remained silent, not wanting to create tension, before the guests arrived. People began arriving promptly at 6. Colleagues from throughout my father's career filed in, many bringing retirement gifts and cards. Friends from various parts of his life greeted him with handshakes and hugs. Extended family members from both sides arrived in groups, creating a lively atmosphere filled with conversation and laughter. I found myself engaged in conversations with relatives I rarely saw, many of whom seemed genuinely interested in my life and career. My cousin Laura pulled me aside at one point, whispering, "This is amazing, Rhonda. Your dad must be so proud of you for putting this together." Her words were a balm to my increasingly irritated spirit. As I circulated through the room, I noticed Diane orchestrating family photographs near the large windows overlooking the river. She had gathered her children Jessica and Troy, along with their spouses, and my father positioning them carefully for what appeared to be formal family portraits. "George, stand between Jessica and Troy," she directed. "Emily, you next to Jessica. Michael beside Troy." Emily was Jessica's husband, and Michael was Troy's wife. The photographer whom I had hired looked uncertain as he prepared to take the pictures. "Should we wait for everyone to be included?" he asked, glancing in my direction. "No, this is just immediate family," Diane replied smoothly. "We can do extended family photos later." I stood rooted to the spot, watching as my father failed to notice or acknowledge my exclusion. It was a scene that had played out countless times throughout my life, yet it never lost its power to wound me. I turned away, focusing instead on ensuring other aspects of the evening were running smoothly. The seating arrangement for dinner revealed another slight. Despite being the host of the event, I had been placed at a table far from my father, with distant relatives and a couple of his former colleagues I barely knew. Meanwhile, Diane, Jessica, Troy, and their spouses occupied the main table with my father, along with Diane's sister and brother-in-law. As dinner service began, I maintained a pleasant expression, engaging with those at my table, while periodically checking that everything was proceeding as planned with the staff. The food was excellent, exactly as we had selected during the tasting, and guests seemed to be enjoying themselves. From across the room, I could see my father smiling and laughing, which was ultimately what mattered most to me. After the main course, several of my father's colleagues stood to offer speeches. They shared amusing anecdotes from his career and expressed sincere appreciation for his mentorship and friendship over the years. Each speech reinforced what I already knew: my father was widely respected and genuinely liked by those who worked with him. When it was Diane's turn to speak, she rose gracefully and tapped her glass for attention. As George's wife of 25 years, she began, "I have witnessed firsthand his dedication to his career and to our family." She continued with a polished speech about their life together, repeatedly using phrases like "our family's support" and "our sacrifice" when referring to his long hours at work. Not once did she acknowledge my presence or contribution either to my father's life or to the event currently taking place. It was as though I existed in a parallel universe visible to everyone except the woman who had married my father when I was 10 years old. As Diane spoke, I noticed something glittering at her throat. It was a diamond necklace I had never seen before, clearly expensive and new. Her wrist also sported a matching bracelet. Given the timing and my knowledge of their financial situation, I had a sinking suspicion about the source of these luxury items. My suspicion was confirmed moments later when I overheard a fragment of conversation between Diane and her sister at the dessert table. "We are thinking Bermuda for our next trip," Diane was saying. "The contractor finished the roof work under budget, so we have a bit extra for travel." The roof work she referred to was undoubtedly the repair I had funded with a $10,000 check just 2 months earlier. The repair that had been described to me as urgent and necessary before the rainy season. I felt heat rising in my face as I realized that once again my financial support had been redirected to fund Diane's desires. I took a deep breath and moved away, not trusting myself to remain composed if I continued listening. The cake was being prepared for presentation, and I needed to ensure the staff had the correct music cued for this portion of the evening. When it was my turn to toast my father, I approached the small podium we had set up near the head table. I had prepared a heartfelt speech celebrating his work ethic, his integrity, and the quiet strength that had defined him throughout my life. Despite the emotions churning within me, I delivered the toast with genuine warmth, focusing solely on honoring the man who had always been my anchor. Imperfect, though our relationship might be. To my father, I concluded, raising my glass. "May your retirement be as rewarding as your career has been successful." Guests applauded warmly, and my father's eyes were suspiciously moist as he nodded his thanks to me. For a brief moment, we connected across the room, father and daughter sharing a private acknowledgement of our bond. Then Diane leaned over to whisper something in his ear, and his attention was drawn away. As the formal portion of the evening concluded and guests began to mingle more freely, the photographer approached my father again. "Let's get a group shot of the whole family," he suggested. Diane immediately began arranging people, placing Jessica and Troy on either side of my father with their spouses beside them and herself in the center of the arrangement. Seeing an opportunity to finally be included in a family photograph, I moved toward the group. As I approached the family group assembling for the photograph, Diane looked up and frowned slightly. Before I could take my place beside my father, she held up her hand in a stopping motion. "This is just for family," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Her tone was light, almost casual, but her meaning was unmistakable. "I am family," I replied, keeping my voice level. "I am George's daughter." Diane laughed, a sound without humor. "You are not part of this family," she said, gesturing to the group around her. "This is our family photo." The room around us grew quiet as people became aware of the exchange. My father stood frozen, his expression a mixture of discomfort and indecision. Jessica and Troy looked at the floor, unwilling to meet my eyes or intervene. The photographer lowered his camera, clearly unsure how to proceed. In that moment, something crystallized within me. Years of subtle exclusion, of being treated as an outsider, while simultaneously being expected to provide financial support, coalesced into perfect clarity. A strange calm settled over me as I realized I was done accepting this treatment. I raised my glass slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at Diane. "Perfect," I said, my voice carrying in the silence. "Then do not ask me for any more money." Diane's face fell as the implications of my words sank in. The confident smile she had worn moments before disappeared entirely. My father's head snapped up, his expression stunned as he looked between Diane and me. The silence in the room was absolute. Guests who had been chatting moments before stood motionless, uncomfortable witnesses to a family drama suddenly laid bare. The clink of glassware from the waitstaff in the background seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Diane attempted to laugh again, though the sound came out strained. "Rhonda is just joking," she said to no one in particular. She has always had an unusual sense of humor. "I am not joking," I replied calmly. "If I am not family, as you have just stated clearly in front of everyone, then there is no reason for me to continue financially supporting this family." Diane's face flushed. "This is hardly the time or place." "Actually, it is exactly the time and place," I interrupted, surprising myself with my steadiness. "For years, I have provided financial support to this family while being treated as an outsider. Let me remind you of exactly what that support has included." I turned slightly to address the room more broadly, though my words were still directed primarily at Diane. $25,000 for Troy's medical bills after his accident. $18,000 to keep Jessica in graduate school when her scholarship fell through. $30,000 for home repairs after the storm damage. Though I recently learned a significant portion of that money went to a kitchen renovation instead. With each item I listed, Diane's complexion grew paler. My father looked increasingly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Jessica and Troy had the grace to appear embarrassed. $8,000 for the new deck, I continued. $5,000 for Troy's car. $7,000 for property tax when you were short last year. And most recently, $10,000 for supposedly urgent roof repairs that somehow funded a cruise instead. Murmurs rippled through the assembled guests. Some looked shocked, others embarrassed to be witnessing such a personal confrontation. My Aunt Clara's mouth had formed a perfect O of surprise. Diane tried to interrupt. "You are exaggerating the amounts." "I am not," I stated firmly. "I have records of every transfer, every check. In total, over the past 5 years, I have provided more than $100,000 to this family. A family that, according to you, I am not part of." Diane looked to my father for support, but he seemed unable to form words. His face had gone ashen as the full extent of my financial contributions was laid bare. "Rhonda," she began, her tone shifting to conciliatory. "Of course you are part of the family in some ways. I simply meant—" "You meant exactly what you said," I replied, "and you have been saying it in one way or another since I was 10 years old. The only difference is that tonight you said it explicitly in front of witnesses, instead of through 1,000 small exclusions and slights." I set my glass down carefully on a nearby table. Family is more than a financial arrangement. It is about respect, inclusion, and mutual care. For 25 years, I have received none of those things from you while being expected to provide unlimited financial support. That arrangement ends tonight." Diane's expression hardened. "You would punish your father because your feelings are hurt." "This is not about punishing anyone," I responded. "This is about establishing healthy boundaries that should have been in place years ago. My father and I will always be family regardless of your attempts to minimize our relationship, but I will no longer fund a lifestyle that I am not welcome to be part of." With that, I turned to my father. "Dad, I love you. That has never changed and never will. But things need to change between us. Call me when you are ready to talk about that." I gave him a gentle kiss on the cheek before walking calmly toward the exit. As I reached the door, I turned back to address the still silent room. "Please everyone enjoy the rest of the evening. The bar will remain open and there is plenty of cake for all. This celebration is about my father's retirement, not about family dynamics. He deserves your continued good wishes on this special occasion." With that, I left the restaurant, stepped into the cool evening air, and took my first deep breath in what felt like hours. My hands were shaking slightly as I retrieved my car keys, but my mind was surprisingly clear. Whatever came next, I had finally spoken my truth after decades of silence. The drive home from the restaurant was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, and despite the cool temperature, I felt overheated. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was beginning to ebb, leaving me emotionally raw and physically exhausted. Once inside my condo, I kicked off my heels and collapsed onto the sofa. The events of the evening played on repeat in my mind. Had I overreacted? Should I have continued to keep the peace as I had for so many years? but as I replayed Diane's words, "You are not part of this family," I knew I had finally responded appropriately to a situation that had been unhealthy for far too long. My phone buzzed with incoming messages. The first was from Troy. "That was intense. We should talk soon." Jessica had also texted, "Mom is furious, but Dad is really upset. Not sure what happens now." There was nothing from my father or Diane. I turned off my phone, needing space to process what had happened and what it meant for my relationships going forward. The mixture of relief, guilt, and uncertainty was overwhelming. I had stood up for myself, yes, but at what cost to my connection with my father? The following days passed in uncomfortable silence. I went to work, maintained my routines, but felt as though I was operating on autopilot. Friends noticed my distraction but accepted my vague explanations about family stress. Only my closest friend Samantha knew the full story, providing a sympathetic ear when I needed to talk through my conflicted feelings. After 3 days of silence, I received a call from my Aunt Clara. "I wanted to check on you," she said without preamble. "That was quite a scene at the party." "I am sorry if I made things uncomfortable," I responded, genuinely regretful about the public nature of the confrontation. "Do not apologize," Clara said firmly. "Some things needed to be said. George has been letting Diane dictate the terms of your relationship for too long. And frankly, none of us had any idea you were supporting them financially to that extent." Clara went on to explain that Diane had been working behind the scenes to control the narrative. Several family members had received calls from her claiming I had made a scene over nothing and exaggerated everything out of jealousy. According to Clara, few were buying Diane's version of events. "Most of us have seen how she treats you over the years," Clara explained. "We just did not know how to intervene. Your father always brushed off concerns, and you seem to be handling it." A week after the party, Jessica called me. Our conversation was awkward but surprisingly honest. "I never really thought about how Mom treated you," she admitted. "It was just the way things were, and I definitely did not know how much financial help you had given us. Mom always said the money came from their savings or investments. I never expected acknowledgement," I told her, "but I did expect basic respect and inclusion." "I get that now," Jessica said quietly. "For what it is worth, I am sorry." Troy reached out the following day with a similar message. He seemed genuinely shocked by the revelation of how much money I had contributed to the family over the years. "I always thought you were just doing well and helping out occasionally," he said. "I had no idea it was so substantial or so frequent." These conversations were healing in their way, but the silence from my father and Diane continued. Through Jessica, I learned that Diane was furious and refusing to discuss the situation rationally. My father was caught in the middle, torn between his wife's anger and his dawning recognition of how I had been treated. 2 weeks after the retirement party, my father finally called. His voice sounded tired and older somehow. "Can we meet for coffee?" he asked. "Just the two of us." We arranged to meet at a cafe halfway between our homes. When I arrived, my father was already there, looking smaller than I remembered. The confident man who had been celebrated for his professional accomplishments just weeks earlier seemed diminished. "Rhonda," he began after we had ordered our drinks, "I do not know where to start." "How about with honesty?" I suggested gently. He nodded, his eyes focusing on the table between us. "I have failed you as a father," he said simply. "I knew things were not right between you and Diane, but I convinced myself it was normal step-family adjustment. I did not want to see how she excluded you, or how that hurt you." "And the money?" I prompted when he fell silent. My father's face flushed with shame. "I knew you were helping with some expenses," he admitted. "But Diane handled most of the financial arrangements. She would tell me she had found the money for things, and I did not question it too deeply. I should have." Our conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, we spoke with complete honesty about the dynamics that had shaped our family for 25 years. My father acknowledged his passive role in allowing Diane to marginalize me. I shared how that exclusion had affected me throughout my formative years and into adulthood. "Things need to change," I told him as our meeting concluded. "I love you and I want you in my life. but I will not continue to be used financially while being treated as an outsider emotionally." My father nodded, tears in his eyes. "I understand," he said. "I do not know exactly what happens next, but I want to fix this. It might take time with Diane, though." His words were both hopeful and realistic. I knew that 25 years of established patterns would not change overnight, particularly with someone as resistant to change as Diane had proven to be. In the weeks that followed, I began working with a therapist to process the complex emotions surrounding my family relationships. Dr. Marshall helped me understand that my willingness to provide financial support despite emotional exclusion was tied to my deep desire for acceptance and belonging. Together, we worked on establishing healthier boundaries and recognizing my own worth beyond what I could provide materially to others. 6 months passed with limited contact with my family. My father called regularly, and we occasionally met for lunch or coffee, always without Diane. These meetings were sometimes awkward, but increasingly genuine as we rebuilt our relationship on more honest terms. He mentioned that he and Diane were struggling financially without my contributions, but he never asked for money, respecting the boundary I had established. During this period, I invested more deeply in relationships with friends who had become my chosen family over the years. Samantha and her husband John included me in their holiday celebrations. My colleague Marcus and I developed a close friendship that gradually evolved into something more romantic. These connections, based on mutual respect and genuine affection, helped me recognize what healthy relationships should feel like. Approximately 8 months after the confrontation at the retirement party, my father called with an unexpected invitation. "Diane would like us all to have dinner together," he said. "She says she wants to talk." I approached the dinner with cautious optimism. We met at a neutral location, a restaurant none of us frequented regularly. Jessica and Troy were also present, creating a buffer that made the situation less intense. Diane was subdued compared to her usual dominant presence. When everyone had ordered, she cleared her throat and addressed me directly. "Rhonda, I want to apologize for what I said at the retirement party," she began. "It was inappropriate and untrue." Her apology was clearly rehearsed and focused primarily on the financial implications of our rift, rather than the decades of emotional exclusion. "I did not realize how much we had come to depend on your generosity," she continued. "Family should support each other, and we have not been supportive of you in return." It was not the deep, insightful apology I might have hoped for, but it was a start. More telling was the changed behavior I observed over the following months. Diane began including me in family text message threads about everyday matters. I received invitations to casual family gatherings that had previously been closed to me. There was an awkward but genuine attempt to create space for me in the family circle. The most significant change came in my relationship with my father. Freed from his role as mediator and messenger, he became more directly engaged with me. We established a weekly breakfast tradition, just the two of us, where we could talk openly about our lives. He began to share more of himself, including his own struggles in his marriage and his regrets about our past relationship. My half-siblings, too, approached our relationship differently. Jessica invited me to lunch occasionally, making efforts to develop a connection independent of our parents. Troy asked for advice about his career, acknowledging my professional success in a way he never had before. These relationships remained works in progress, but the change in trajectory was meaningful. As for financial support, I established clear boundaries. When genuine emergencies arose, I considered helping on a case-by-case basis, but the automatic expectation of my assistance had ended. More importantly, any help I provided came with conditions of transparency and acknowledgement. A year after the confrontation at the retirement party, my father and I sat at our regular breakfast spot discussing recent events in our lives. "I never thought things would change this much," he admitted. "For years I convinced myself that keeping the peace was the same as maintaining a healthy family. I was wrong. We all played our parts," I acknowledged. "I enabled the situation by providing money without demanding respect in return." My father reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture of affection that had become more common between us. "I am proud of you, Rhonda," he said. "Not just for your success, but for having the courage to stand up for yourself when I did not have the courage to stand up for you." That moment of connection, of genuine understanding between father and daughter, felt like the culmination of a journey that began with those words at the retirement party. "You are not part of this family." In standing up to that exclusion, I had paradoxically created the possibility for a more authentic family connection than I had experienced in 25 years. The experience taught me that true family bonds are built on mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine inclusion. Financial transactions cannot substitute for emotional connection, and setting healthy boundaries is not just permissible but necessary for authentic relationships. Sometimes speaking your truth, even when it disrupts long-established patterns, is the only path to healing. Have you ever had to set a difficult boundary with family members who took you for granted? What was the hardest part about standing up for yourself? Share your experiences in the comments below. If my story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to hear more stories about finding strength in difficult family situations. Remember that your worth is never determined by what you can provide for others, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do, both for yourself and others, is to establish clear boundaries. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you courage in your own journey toward healthier relationships.